warning, not get to the cross, which is exactly what happened. And I thought we were going to interject the doctor and go out of order, and we have no objection to that, to accommodate the doctor's.
All right. Let's do that.
Detective Gill's retired. He can wait.
With this. Let's do that. Keep your seat. When the jurors come in, I'll explain to them that we're going to take a witness out of order, that there will be cross-examination of this witness, and we will bring him back on the stand for that purpose after we interpose another witness. So that'll be fun.
And would Detective Gill be required or ordered to leave the courtroom, just to be consistent, whatever the counsel's in court's pleasure is? I just want to know what he's supposed to do.
Well, I think we should remain consistent with the sequestration order, and that he's, that there's nothing that I anticipate that this particular witness would testify to that would be necessarily relevant to Detective Gill's testimony, but nevertheless, we do have an order, and I think we should comply by it.
That sounds fine. We'll ask you to remain outside until called. Okay, anything else that we need to take up? All right, Mr. Arbor, anything further?
You don't want to address the other issue at this time with respect to the statements? Okay.
Nothing
else at this time.
All right, very good. Let's bring jurors in. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to take a witness out of order. Namely, this witness is going to step down. He will be recalled, and the defense will have an opportunity to cross-examine this witness, Detective Gill. There's another witness who has a scheduling issue, so we're going to go ahead and bring that witness on now, complete that testimony, and then recall Detective Gill at a later time. So if you'll step down, sir. And Mr. Fawcett, if you'll call your next witness, sir.
Thank you. State we call Dr. Scott Ween.
Bible and raise your right. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated.
All right, Mr. Fawcett.
Thank you, Your Honor. State your name for the court, please.
Scott Ween.
And how do you spell your name?
Scottwein.
Where do you work, sir?
Raleigh Orthopedic Clinic.
What is your position there?
I'm an orthopedic surgeon.
You're licensed to practice medicine in the state of North Carolina?
Yes.
When did you become licensed?
In North Carolina. I believe that was finished 2002.
All right. Please tell us, Dr. Ween, about your educational background and your medical training.
Okay. I attended Washington and Lee University for undergraduate and graduated in 1998. Went on to UNC Chapel Hill for medical school, finished there in 2002, and then went to University of Virginia for a residency in orthopedic surgery from 2002 to 2007, and a fellowship in hand surgery at the Indiana Hand Center from 2007 to 8.
You have a specialty in medicine?
Yes,
What is that, please?
hand and upper extremity surgery.
Are you board certified in orthopedic surgery?
Yes.
What does board certification in orthopedic surgery involve?
It involves completing an accredited residency and taking an exam after you finish the completion of your training, and then taking a second oral exam after you've been in practice for 2 years.
Approach the witness, Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
Exhibit 81 for identification purposes. Doctor, do you recognize what State's Exhibit 81 is?
Yes,
What is State's Exhibit 81?
that's my CV.
Okay. Doctor, are you a member of any professional organizations?
Yes.
Can you tell us which ones, please?
The American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, American Society for Surgery of the Hand, UNC Medical Alumni Association, North Carolina Orthopedic Association, the North Carolina Medical Society, and the Wake County Medical Society.
Have you written any publications or papers as to hand surgery?
As to hand surgery, I've written some book chapters and some updates for an online publication.
At this point, the state would offer State's Exhibit 81 into evidence.
Any objection? No objection. It's allowed.
At this point, the state would tender Dr. Scott Ween as an expert in orthopedic surgery.
Any objection? No objection. His testimony will be received as proffered.
Thank you. Doctor, in the latter part of April 2013, was Nation Hahn a patient of yours?
Yes.
Tell us what brought Mr. Hahn to your practice, please.
He had sustained traumatic lacerations to his hands.
During the course of treating Mr. Hahn, did you make records of your various visits and medical treatment of Nation Hahn?
Yes.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
Let me show you what's marked as State's Exhibit 82. Doctor, do you recognize what State's Exhibit 82 is?
Yes.
What is State's Exhibit 82?
These are my clinic notes and operative report.
And are these records, are they made at or near the time of the events noted in the records?
Yes,
And who makes those records?
I do.
They're your personal notes and operative findings?
Yes.
All right. And they're kept in the normal course of your medical practice?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would offer an evidence, State's Exhibit 82.
Any objection? No objection. It's allowed.
Doctor, if you would, let's start your first visit with Mr. Nation Hahn. Tell us the date of that office visit and in detail what occurred, please.
Okay. I had seen him initially on April 25th, 2013. He had was seeing me as his first initial follow-up after having been discharged from the emergency room at WakeMed a couple of days earlier. And I had taken down his bandages and examined his hands, and in order to determine if any further treatment would be required.
Okay, and what were your physical examination?
He had some superficial lacerations to a couple of areas on his right hand. On his left hand, he had deeper lacerations at the base of his middle and ring fingers. He was unable to actively flex the middle finger. His ring finger, he was unable to actively flex one of the joints, and he had some numbness along this one side of the middle finger.
Okay. Were his hands or hand splinted in any fashion when he presented on April 25th at your office?
Yes.
And tell us exactly what that means.
He had underlying gauze over the wounds and had a slab of plaster and then ACE wraps over top of that, just as the discharge bandage from the emergency room.
And was that as to both hands?
Yes.
After your physical observations you made, tell us what else occurred at that first April 25th consult with Mr. Hahn.
After the examination, I had recommended that we proceed with exploration of the wounds on his left hand and repair of the structures that had been transected.
What was your assessment as to the left hand of Mr. Hahn? What injuries was he facing that needed to be addressed surgically?
I suspected that he had transected both of the flexor tendons to his long finger and a nerve along the radial aspect of the long finger, the radial digital nerve, and I suspected that he had transected the deep flexor tendon of the ring finger.
Okay. If you would, maybe not dumb it down for us, but tell us as to those two fingers, the middle and ring finger, what exactly your medical assessment you just defined for us. Can you give us a little more general terms what that means?
Sure. You have underneath the skin, you have a couple of tendons. Tendons are what runs from the muscle to the bone. It allows you to flex the fingers down. Lying along either side of the tendon, you have a nerve and an artery that supply the sensation to each respective side of the finger. Also supply the majority of the blood flow to each of the to your fingers. And he had effectively, with the traumatic laceration that had transected, gone deep enough down to the bone to transect both of the flexor tendons on the long finger, the nerve on one side of the long finger, and then at least one of the tendons to his ring finger.
Okay. Based on your assessment, what was your recommendation to Mr. Hahn?
To proceed with exploration and repair of the tendons and nerve.
Did you go over the risk of surgery with Mr. Hahn at that time?
Yes.
Tell us what you told him and what are the risks of that particular type of procedure you were recommending?
Bleeding, infection, pain, damage to surrounding structures, stiffness, weakness, poor functional outcome, possible need for further surgery, and tendon re-rupture.
Okay. Did you also tell Mr. Hahn about after the surgery what his expectations might be?
Yes.
And what were those expectations about anything he would have to do after the surgery?
That he would require a prolonged course of therapy and splinting.
Okay. Was Mr. Hahn agreeable to your surgery recommendation?
Yes,
All right. When did you conduct surgery on Mr. Hahn?
I did.
Tell us, when was the date of the surgery?
April 30th,
Is this
2013.
Is this the second time you now see Mr. Hahn?
Yes.
The initial, all right. Tell us about April 30th, about the surgery, please, in some detail.
Okay. So we had taken him to the operating room. The surgery begins by removing the sutures from which had been placed in the emergency room, and then I explored both of the wounds and essentially found what I had suspected, which is that you had to extend the incisions in either direction in order to better expose the underlying structures. And as it turns out, he had transected both of the flexor tendons to the long finger and one tendon to the ring finger completely, the other tendon to the ring finger about 80%. He'd also transected the nerve along the radial aspect of the long finger. But you essentially just go in there and do an inventory of the various structures, tendons, nerves, and then we repaired both of the flexor tendons to each finger and repaired the nerve to the side of the long finger.
Where did the surgery take place?
Rex Hospital.
All right. Was Mr. Hahn unconscious at the time of the surgery?
He was given anesthetic to sedate him. Yes, he was unconscious.
And as you begin your procedures, how do you place a tourniquet?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that and the reason for it.
So you place a tourniquet on the upper arm in order to cut off the blood supply to the arm during the surgery so that you can have a better visualization of the structures.
What's the first structure or finger that you began exploring?
In this case, it was the wound at the base of the ring finger.
All right. And tell us, please, about your findings as to the ring finger of Mr. Hahn.
The digital nerve and artery along both sides of the tendon were intact. The tendon sheath, which is this structure that surrounds the tendons, had been penetrated, and the deep flexor tendon had been completely transected, and the superficial flexor tendon had a near full thickness transection.
Okay. Those are two separate tendons?
Yes.
One's cut all the way through and one is nearly cut all the way through?
Yes.
Okay. And what did you have to do to repair those two tendons as to the ring finger?
We had to excise a portion of the tendon sheath that surrounds the tendons in order to gain access to the tendons. We use a couple of sutures to repair the tendons back, and then there's another stitch that goes around the periphery of the tendon as well. So it's 3 stitches in each tendon.
The middle ring finger, tell us about the exploration of the middle finger
Okay.
and your findings.
The middle finger had also, the wound had penetrated through the flexor tendon sheath a little bit further distally than with the ring finger. The radial digital nerve and artery had been completely transected. The ulnar digital nerve and artery were intact. And both of the flexor tendons had been completely transected.
So both the tendons in the middle finger have been cut all the way through.
Yes.
An artery been cut all the way through.
Yes.
Major artery.
It is one of the major arteries to the finger, yes.
What is the notation about not being able to access the distal stump of the profundus? What does that mean?
Depending on the position of the hand at the time of the injury, that will ultimately determine the level of that the tendon retracts to. If you cut your hand while your fingers are completely extended, then the level of the tendon that the ends of the tendon will retract to is approximately just the level of your skin laceration. But if you have a clenched fist as if you're grabbing something, then when you open up your finger, the end of the tendon is going to retract out towards the further distally in the finger. So the level of the tendon injury may be further distal than the level of the skin laceration.
After exploring the middle finger, what did you do to repair those two tendons in the artery?
We repaired the flexor tendons with each with a suture repair, and the nerve was repaired with sutures, and a protective sheath was placed around the nerve.
There was nerve damage to this particular finger.
Yes.
How does the surgery end?
The surgery ends. I cauterized the radial digital artery, and the wounds were irrigated, and then the skin edges were reapproximated, and a splint was applied.
And what type of splint? Can you describe what that means, a splint was applied?
It's called a dorsal blocking splint. It's a slab of plaster that will immobilize the wrist and fingers in a slightly flexed position in order to minimize the tension on the repairs.
How was Mr. Hahn awakened?
He was awakened. They eased off on the anesthetic, and he was awakened and taken to the recovery room in good condition.
How long did Mr. Hahn's surgery last?
How long did it take? I believe it took around 2 hours.
And at conclusion of the surgery, did you speak to Mr. Hahn about what he could expect and what you required of Mr. Hahn?
Yes.
What did you tell him, please?
That he was going to follow up with us in approximately 10 days, but that he was going to see a therapist sooner than that, in 1 to 2 days. And at that point, he would begin the flexor tendon rehabilitation protocol. He was also given prescriptions for pain medication and anti-nausea medication.
All right. The next time you saw Mr. Hahn, what was the date, please?
May 13th, 2013.
All right. This is about 2 weeks post-op.
Yes.
Tell us about that 2 weeks post-op appointment with Mr. Hahn.
In the interim, he had met with a therapist and had a brace made. At that point, his wounds seemed to be healing nicely. The tendons still seemed to be intact by the posture that his fingers were resting in. He had persistent numbness to the side of the middle finger, which was to be expected. I think that's the pertinent findings.
And what type of brace did he have on his hand at this point in time?
He had a dorsal blocking splint.
Okay, what exactly is that?
It's made out of a thin plastic material. It's a brace that he can take on and off in order to do some exercises with his fingers.
And what, if you know, what he was seeing a therapist where exactly?
I don't recall exactly where he saw the therapist initially, but thereafter, I believe he came to therapy at our office.
Do you make some notes here about he was out of town
Yes.
shortly after the death of his wife, seen an out of town?
Yes.
What's the next office visit you have with Nation Hahn, please?
June 3rd, 2013.
All right. Is that 5 weeks?
Approximately, yes.
Post-op. Tell us about that appointment.
At that appointment, he seemed to be doing well. His fingers looked good. The tendon repairs still seemed to be intact. He was able to maintain a clenched fist. He did still have some stiffness, but by exam, the tendons did seem to be intact. And at that point, he was cautioned against full unrestricted activity until the tendons had, for the most part, completely healed.
Full unrestricted activity, you weren't clearing him for that until another appointment 5 weeks later, is that what you told him?
Yes.
What a pulley ring?
That in order to access the tendons to his ring finger, in order to clear up some space for the repair, I had to excise a portion of the pulley, which is a thickened portion of the tendon sheath that surrounds the tendon. And since I had to excise a portion of that structure, which is an important structure, I had the therapist to mold a little ring to go over that part of the finger to minimize the stress on that area.
The next appointment you had with Mr. Hahn, when was it, please?
July 22nd, 2013.
About 3 months post-op?
Yes.
All right, tell us about that appointment, please.
At that appointment, the fingers still looked good. He still had persistent numbness along the radial aspect of the long fingertip. He seemed to have good excursion of the flexor tendons to the middle finger.
What does that mean?
Means that the tendons are able to glide, and he can actively flex the joints that the tendons are designed to do.
Okay, could he do that for both fingers?
He could do it more so for the middle finger than the ring finger.
What other observations did you make at that July 22nd appointment?
Well, I suspected that his I suspected that his stiffness was in part secondary to scar tissue adhesions limiting the active excursion of the tendons.
Did you make a recommendation to him 3 months after surgery as far as his daily routine at this point?
Yes.
What did you tell Mr. Hahn?
I advised him to gradually resume normal activities.
Okay. Did you ask him that you wanted to see him back?
Yes.
And what was the time you wanted to see him back when?
Another 5 to 6 weeks.
Okay. Finally, tell us about your last appointment with Mr. Hahn.
At our last appointment, which was roughly 4.5 months post-operatively, he seemed to be the long finger or the middle finger distal interphalangeal joint seemed to be moving much better. His motion had considerably improved. The ring finger flexor tendon was still a bit weak, but he was able to flex both fingers into the palm. Didn't have full motion, but he had a functional arc of motion.
Functional motion, not full motion. Was he complaining still of numbness?
Yes.
What was your conclusion as far as prognosis from that point forward?
I suspect that he would be left with some degree of residual stiffness and likely some degree of residual numbness.
And did you recommend him for some further exercises?
Transition to a home exercise program.
And is it your testimony that during the course of your treatment of Mr. Hahn, once the out-of-town therapist was no longer used, that he was seeing a therapist in addition to seeing you
Yeah.
for these various appointments?
Yes.
Thank you, Doctor. I have no further questions.
Cross-examination, Ms. Elliott?
We don't have any questions, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, sir. You may step down. Is this witness to be excused from his subpoena?
From the state, yes.
All right, sir, you're excused from your subpoena. You're free to go. Thank you. So we'll resume with Detective Gill.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, if you'll have him return to the courtroom, please. All right, sir, do you recognize you're still under oath?
Yes, sir, I do.
Very good. And the state had completed its direct, is that correct, Mr. Foster?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Arbor? Cross-examination, sir.
Good afternoon. That's okay.
I'm going to ask you some questions. We know each other. I refresh my recollection about that from past viewings, correct?
That's correct.
And you said you've been retired now for a number of months or over a year now?
April 1st will be a year.
I'm going to trust you haven't forgot everything you did in those post-employment
Not everything.
wars. With that?
Not everything.
You were retired as a homicide detective with the department, correct?
That's correct.
You were with, I believe you said homicide 1 unit, correct?
Correct.
Your unit, and this holds true for the entire line of questioning I have. If I say something wrong or something you want to correct, you go ahead and do it, okay?
Okay.
You were homicide 1, which is the lead homicide unit for Raleigh Police Department, correct?
We have 2 homicide units. They're equal. Each unit has 5 detectives and a sergeant. They rotate schedules. It depends on which team is on call or on duty at the time when a case comes in to determine who it's assigned to.
And maybe I stated it wrong by putting priority in homicide 1, but you were a homicide detective.
Correct.
They just, would it be fair for me to say they just don't take any uniformed officer and make them a homicide detective, isn't that correct?
Correct.
You and the others who do that work are typically officers who have a great deal of experience, largely from the, I mean, there's no age requirement for it, is there?
No, sir.
But typically, nobody just comes out of the academy and becomes a homicide detective, correct?
That's correct.
They're uniformed officers, they might be assigned to certain units like drugs and vice or anything like that, and then eventually they work their way up to being a homicide detective, correct?
Correct.
What other things did you do prior to being a homicide detective?
Once I first got promoted, worked in drugs and vice for a while, got assigned to airport interdiction at Raleigh-Durham Airport, worked drugs out there for a couple of years. Went to the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration Task Force here in Raleigh, assigned there for 5 years as a task force officer. Worked sex crimes for a couple of years just prior to going to homicide.
And of course, all previous to that, there was, I'm assuming, a period of time when you were a patrol officer.
Yes, sir, 12 years.
And, it's a while ago, but even before you did that, you had a certain amount of training, even back in the day when you started, that you had to go to an academy before you could start working as a police officer with the department, correct?
Correct.
I'm not gonna go through everything, but that we've had some testimony about that from other officers, but it would be fair for me to say that when you start to become an investigative officer as opposed to patrol officer, well, certainly your role changes, correct?
Correct.
I mean, there's nothing that prohibits you as an investigative officer from being involved in an arrest, correct?
You could clarify that.
Yeah,
please.
let me clarify it. Because sometimes in an investigative role, like when you were working drugs and vice, sometimes some of the things you're doing is you are setting up an arrest and you participate in the actual arrest of individuals. Just because you're an investigator or a detective doesn't mean you stop having to arrest people from time to time, correct?
Correct.
It literally, sometimes in the commission of a crime or shortly after the commission of a crime, correct?
Correct.
As a homicide detective, it's not typical. I mean, typically what's happened is there has been a crime, and then you are asked to come in after the event has occurred and conduct the investigation of that event, correct?
Correct.
That involves a number of different things, but essentially what you're doing is you're coordinating, you're trying to gather up all the information that's been collected by the various agencies and people involved in the case, put it all together and try to figure out what happened. Would that be fair?
Correct.
That doesn't mean just talking to police officers. It means talking to anybody who would have some involvement in the matter, correct?
Yes, sir.
Civilians, witnesses, people that might have gone by. Sometimes you'll send an officer out, you'll delegate an officer to go out, just talk to all the neighbors, see if they saw anything, correct?
That's a common practice, yes, sir.
In fact, there's a number of protocols with respect to doing investigations, and fair for me to say, despite whatever you've tried to forget in the time you've been off on retirement, you knew most of them, or all of them, at the time that you were a homicide detective. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been a homicide detective. Would that have been fair?
Fair. Yes, sir.
And as you said, you're a sort of a select group. You mentioned there's 5 of you in the one unit, 5 in the other. Because you have some supervising officers too, right?
Correct.
That oversee the other detectives.
Correct. There are 2 sergeants and 5 detectives under each sergeant.
And because of that, and because you're in homicides, and there's typically a lot of information that has to be gathered in investigating a homicide, isn't that true?
Yes, sir.
It's not uncommon for detectives, the other detectives in your unit, to work together or to assist, or when I say your unit, I mean all homicide detectives. There's nothing prohibiting someone, say, from the homicide 2 unit from working with homicide 1, correct?
Nothing to prohibit that, no, sir.
Right. If they should happen upon information or gather information that happens to be pertinent to your case, and you may have done that in your experience, you'll go and pass it on to whoever is working the case, right?
Yes, sir.
And speaking about working the case, one of the other duties of a detective is you're not always all just working randomly. There's a protocol. Someone's usually assigned to be the lead detective, correct?
That's correct.
You've been a lead detective.
Yes, sir.
In this case, you were not the lead detective.
That is correct.
The lead detective in this matter was Detective Morse, who's been seated here throughout the trial behind Mr. Fawcett. And you know him because you worked with him, right?
That's correct.
And you were working with him on this time in April of 2013 when you were talking about this case, right?
Yes, sir.
I talked briefly about your time when you first started and going to the academy. You remember back in the day they taught you about how if you're involved in a case, you're going to be asked to prepare a report or a supplement regarding your activities in a case.
Yes, sir.
And that's for a variety of reasons, right?
Correct.
Some of it is to remind yourself so that you can differentiate what you do on a case, correct?
Correct.
Even though there may not be, say, as many homicides as you would have experienced with, say, traffic stops back in the day when you're a arrest officer, you were dealing with more than one at a time typically, correct?
Correct.
And you want to make sure you're keeping your information together and straight, so you do a report to remind yourself of what you're doing, right?
Correct.
You're also working with other detectives, so you want to keep them alert to what's going on, correct?
Correct. If they have access to the report, yes, sir.
Right. And supplements, the way they do them now, they go into a system where you can pull them up and look at them if you're working on on a particular case, correct?
If you have access to that portion, yes, sir.
Right. Well, different from the old days when we used to do them by hand and typewriter, right?
Yes, sir, it is.
They come in a lot faster now because of, particularly for the patrol officers, they got the computers in the car and stuff, and it speeds things up, right?
It's pretty much immediate once they complete the report.
When you do a report as a homicide detective, or almost really as any detective, as your investigative responsibilities, or become an investigator, your responsibilities become a little more, there's a requirement for a little more detail than there was, say, as a patrol officer. Would that be fair?
I don't know that there's a requirement for more detail. I think the more experience you have, you will include more detail.
And typically, if you're not good at it, including that detail, you don't typically make homicide, correct?
I don't know what the decision-making, what
you
kind
made
of
it.
factors that the command staff uses to make those selections.
But you made it.
Yes, sir.
So I won't ask you to comment on your own abilities. But when you prepare reports, you try to be careful. You try to write things down that are critical to the case so that you can remember them and you can share that information with others, right?
Yes, sir.
You did that in this case, right?
Yes, sir.
You did prepare a supplement regarding what you did in regards to this particular case. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And did you review that supplement prior to testifying here today?
I did, sir.
When you did that, did you make note of the fact that in your supplement, there wasn't really a whole lot of entry with respect to the interview that you testified about that was done of Mr. Broyhill on the 26th of April, isn't that correct?
That is correct.
Part of that is because you didn't have to write down what was being said. You were recording it, correct?
Detective Morse was recording it,
Oh, Detective Morse was.
correct,
Okay. But you knew there was a recording being done of the interview.
correct.
And typically on a homicide, if you can, that's the preferred way to do it, is to record the interview, correct?
Definitely,
That way there can be no question later on as to what the person said. You're not basing it solely on a report. Someone said this, didn't say this, and you don't have the issue of it. You've got the person actually talking, correct?
correct, and also I'm not as good at shorthand as a recorder is.
But you did do a supplement, and the supplement does cover a lot of what you did prior to taking the interview that day, correct?
Correct,
Your involvement on this case started on the day of the crime, which was Monday, April 22nd. And your involvement began at about 6:38 that evening, correct?
that's correct,
You got a phone call from Sergeant Cashwell to respond to this call, correct?
correct.
Who is Sergeant Cashwell?
He was the Unit 1 sergeant at that time for Homicide Unit 1,
You're the head of the unit.
correct.
So you were, and based upon the information that had been provided to you and the time that the event was to have occurred, did you ascertain that you were there a little more than an hour after the time that this thing had happened? If you know.
Possibly around that time.
Okay. You mentioned this morning that when you got to the scene, you did what you would normally do as a homicide detective, which is go talk to everybody, start talking to everybody and find out what do we got here, right?
Initially, when the first homicide units that will respond to the scene, once you arrive, if there are any other investigative units who have arrived but prior to you, on this particular case, the two detectives that had arrived were from the aggravated assault unit.
Was that the, I believe you said their names were Detectives Fry and Torrance?
Correct, that is correct.
Go ahead.
Once I arrive there, the first thing that I do is we get briefed by anyone that has more knowledge than I do, and that's what I did when I first arrived.
And you're trying to get as much information as you can, and they've been there prior to you, correct?
Correct.
So they've talked to other officers, correct?
I don't know who they talked to, but
They've talked
they
to
would
you,
have talked to somebody.
and I didn't mean to cut you off. You sort of can assume based upon the protocols, they've talked to somebody. If they told you they hadn't talked to anybody, they wouldn't start telling you things, right?
Correct.
They would tell you, we just got here, we haven't talked to anybody else either, right?
Correct.
But they were, you prepared a report, and in your supplement regarding that time that you met with them, and prior to your, I believe you testified there was a time when you retrieved the 911 calls on this case, correct?
I don't believe I've testified to that, but that is correct.
Yeah, maybe you did. But you did do that, right?
Yes, sir, I did.
You retrieved the 911 calls.
I requested those, yes, sir.
When you made your entry into your supplement about what happened at the location that evening at 1705 Tealwood Place, you reviewed that.
Yes, sir.
You made no mention at that point of any word at all about the victim in this case, Ms. Hahn, or the other victim, Mr. Hahn, having confronted the person who's now been identified as the suspect, Jonathan Broyhill, about money. You made no entry of that, did you?
No, sir, I did not.
That would have been, if that information had been passed on to you by one of the detectives, you agree with me that that is something that you would have included in your report?
I feel certain I would have, yes, sir.
Afterwards, now that was the evening. I don't even know, did you remember, were you on shift or did you get called in on that? if you know?
I do not recall.
Do not recall. But, and as a homicide detective, that would not be uncommon, by the way. Sometimes you guys are off shift, and if you are on shift, you'll typically be called to a homicide scene if there's one that needs investigation. But it's not uncommon to be called in from off duty, even if your services are needed.
Not at all.
That's common.
It's very common, yes, sir.
So that day, you could have been home, you could have been at work. It wouldn't have mattered. If you get the call, you go to these things.
Correct.
2 days later, and this is not uncommon either, even though Detective Morse is the lead detective in this case, it's not uncommon to task some of the other detectives in the unit to do other things to assist in this investigation, correct?
Normally when a case comes in, you have the lead detective that's assigned, and that's based solely upon a rotation system. The squad as a whole will work that investigation as far as we can take it. Each member of the squad we will have briefings where we share information of what we've learned based on the assignments that we had that were given. So it's worked as a squad.
So most likely, anybody who's involved in this squad would have, or could have had, some involvement in this case.
Correct, if they were present, yes, sir.
2 days after the crime occurs, on the 24th of April, one of the things that you are tasked with, I think it was, I don't know if it was from Sergeant Cashwell, and you can correct me, it might have been just one of the other detectives. It could have even been of your own initiative. At that point, a concern was raised about the possibility of some money possibly having been taken or embezzled from a campaign account belonging to Brad Miller, correct?
That is correct.
That was the 24th of April, right?
Correct.
So that was Wednesday. At that point, that's about all you knew, was that you've been asked to go investigate to look into the possibility of an embezzlement. Would that be correct?
That's correct.
You didn't have any particulars, nobody told you anything or showed you any documents or said this is some proof of anything that he'd been taking money, right?
That's correct.
Just a statement that there might be something that requires it to be investigated.
Correct.
That's exactly what you did. The first thing you did was, being that it's a official campaign account, you contacted, that's a political thing, and sometimes political investigations are conducted by the State Bureau of Identification, correct?
Yes, sir.
You were familiar with that procedure, so one of the things you did was you contacted we refer to it as the SBI, and you contacted the SBI to see if there was an investigation going on with respect to the Brad Miller account, correct?
Yes, sir, I did.
And you learned that, in fact, there was none.
That is correct.
They weren't aware of anything.
That is correct.
Well, you don't just not get an answer and stop. You guys are like bloodhounds. You keep going, right?
When I spoke with Agent Michael East with the SBI, he referred me to a lady with the North Carolina Board of Elections and recommended that I contact her to see if she knew of anything
And
that
you
he was
did
not
that?
aware of. And I did, yes, sir.
You contacted the Board of Elections and asked them if they had received any information, this is on the 24th of April, or heard anything about improprieties of embezzlement, that is, with the Brad Miller campaign account, correct?
That is correct.
They indicated that they had no information regarding that, but they did provide you with the name of the treasurer, right?
That is correct.
John Wallace.
Yes, sir.
After sort of hunting all that down on that Wednesday, you then took it upon yourself the following day, or through direction of some other officer, I don't know, maybe on your own, maybe you recall. But on the next day, the Thursday, the 25th, you reached out to Mr. Wallace in the afternoon of that day, correct?
I did, yes, sir.
About 2:45 in the afternoon of that day.
That's correct.
And you had a lengthy interview with him, didn't you?
Yes, sir, on the phone.
Over the phone.
Yes, sir.
You learned from that interview about that he was familiar with Mr. Broyhill and the victim, Ms. Hahn, correct?
Correct.
And how they worked for this company that did the strategizing and sort of record keeping for the Brad Miller campaign, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Wallace advised that most of the time he would meet with, all the time actually, he would meet with Mr. Broyhill. Some of the time he'd meet with Ms. Hahn, correct?
That is correct.
I think he mentioned that, in fact, he did not speak ill of Mr. Broyhill at that meeting. Isn't that true?
That is true.
He said he'd been someone who, at least for him, had been good to work with, responsive, and to the best of his knowledge, honest, correct?
That's correct.
He recounted for you a meeting that they had had back in January of that year, 2013, where they talked about reports. But I don't think he gave you a specific date as to when that occurred. Is that correct?
That's correct. He just said sometime in January of 2013.
In fact, he had talked with you and said there'd been another company that did this type of work for the campaign, but they had been replaced by Ms. Hahn's company, and I think he said that they'd been meeting on a quarterly basis since sometime in 2010, correct?
Correct.
The most recent of those meetings, he told you was sometime the week prior to the Ms. Hahn passing away, correct?
That is correct.
And I think he said, I don't know, I think he recalled on that day, it was they may have met on a Tuesday. You didn't take any steps at that. You were just taking a statement at that point. You weren't trying to verify whether or not that was actually the correct day or not, correct?
Correct. It was just a statement.
At that point, that would, whether he was right on the day or not, that would not have been a critical piece of information.
Correct.
He did mention that on that day, the only concern he had on that day at that meeting was that, because I'm going to get into, to jump up, he's going to talk about things that happened later in the week, eventually with you, correct?
Correct.
But on that day, the only thing he was, I think the word he used was raise some questions, was that the candidate, Brad Miller, was supposed to have been repaid some loans, and they were still showing as open on a report, correct?
And there was a loan that Congressman Miller had made to the campaign that was to be repaid, and that was
Still showing as open.
showing as an outstanding debt. Yes, sir.
Right, he's asking, what's this all about? I thought
Right.
this was paid.
Right.
I think the way he described it to you is that it raised some questions, but not concerns.
Correct.
He did not assume any wrongdoing was going on.
That is correct.
In fact, I think he told you that he expected there was a very logical and coherent explanation for it, correct?
Correct.
But then he got a phone call then he told you he got a phone call later in the week from an individual by the name of Tom Keating, right?
Yes, sir.
And he had been that's the strategist that did this before the
Prior.
company that Ms. Hahn owned, right?
Correct.
And this Mr. Keating had alerted him to the fact that the reports had not been filed, and that there were some letters sent to the campaign back in October of 2012 and February in 2013, and he had not been put on notice about them at that meeting that he had just had, correct?
Correct.
Go ahead.
Apparently, Mr. Keating actually saw those on the website and contacted Mr. Wallace to let him know they existed.
Yeah, and he wasn't just saying that basically, he wasn't saying that they didn't bring it up on Monday. He said they've never brought it up to me.
That's correct.
If Mr. Keating, so it led you to believe if Mr. Keating hadn't brought it to his attention, he wouldn't have known about it.
It's very possible.
Yeah. Now, on that day when he was talking to you about that, when he was talking about that day, I should say, and about those two letters, he didn't, at that point, like right then, provide you with the letters, did he?
No, sir, he did not.
And he made no mention to you on that day about anything involving some refunds that might have been made to some Brad Miller contributors, did he?
At that point, no, sir.
Also, he said at that point in that week, even though he'd been contacted, he still did not assume any wrongdoing. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
He also said that on that day that they met, when Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill were in the room with him, his perception was that Ms. Hahn wasn't raising any concerns or suspicions regarding Mr. Broyhill at that meeting, correct?
Correct.
Now, he did now, of course, at this time that you're having this interview, this is, again, the 25th. So it's Thursday of that week, right?
Yes, sir.
He did speculate, he was just speculating that, maybe she confronted him, Ms. Hahn. Maybe she confronted Mr. Broyhill about these things, and maybe that caused an issue. He did speculate to that.
He did express that, yes, sir.
But he had, at that point, no basis, in fact, to state that. That was just a speculation, right?
Correct.
He had no idea why this thing happened.
Correct.
He did say, however, that he had gotten a phone call and had spoken with Brad Miller that day prior to talking to you, didn't he?
Yes, sir, he did.
And he said that it had been related to him that one of Mr. Miller's former staffers was getting a phone call from some bill collector about a Time Warner cable bill.
That's correct.
And something about that the check had bounced.
Yes, sir.
So Mr. Wallace explained to you on the 25th that at that point, that didn't make any sense to him because the last thing he knew, there was like maybe $62,000 in that account.
That is correct.
And this is what he's telling you on the 25th of April, correct?
Yes, sir.
He did, however, tell you that he was going to go the next day, which was the 26th, the Friday, and check the bank, and if there was anything, he would let you know, right?
He had a meeting with the bank scheduled for the 26th.
But there was certainly no mention on his part in that interview of any suspicion of embezzlement by Mr. Broyhill or any money missing when he's talking to you on the 25th.
No, sir. He just knew some things didn't add up. That's all he knew.
Right. I'm getting the call from got the call from the former strategist and about the reports, and speaking to that, he did, however, he did tell you when he was telling you about the call from the strategist, he did tell you that he responded to that. He sent an email to Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill that same day that he was alerted to that, right?
Yes, sir, he did.
And I think he forwarded you those emails, correct?
Yes, sir, he did.
And so you recall seeing them.
I do.
I think he told you put in the subject line, help.
Right. That's correct.
And he said that, he told you that, but he did, and of course, again, he's doing this interview the 25th. This is all after the event has occurred. He told you that the day after he sent that email, he did get a response from Mr. Broyhill.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And that they were going to look into it and take care of it. He still, at that point, wasn't thinking there was any wrongdoing or problems. back on the week prior to Ms. Hahn passing.
That is correct.
But when he's telling you this story on the 25th, and he is now have the additional concern about the call from Brad Miller that morning about a bill collector saying that a check had bounced. That's why he sort of indicated to you, I'm gonna go check the bank out tomorrow and I'll get back to you if there's something else. Something along those lines, correct?
He told me he'd have a better understanding the following day when he met with the bank.
Now, later that afternoon, I think you talked with him at about 2:45, correct?
Yes, sir, that's when it began.
Later that afternoon at about 6 o'clock. So again, we're back on the 25th. At about 6 o'clock in the evening, you and Detective Morse here went over to WakeMed to do what you put in your report as a follow-up interview with Mr. Broyhill, correct?
Correct.
Now, those were the words you used, follow-up interview.
Correct.
That was an intentional term, meaning there had already been an interview with Mr. Broyhill, correct?
Correct.
Now, you were not party to that interview, correct? The first one.
That's true.
And if there'd been more than one, you weren't party to them. You had not yet met Mr. Broyhill until that day on the 25th, when you went there with Detective Morse to WakeMed, correct?
That is correct.
But, like you said, when you do these things, you're investigating, you're talking, you're learning. You knew there had been an interview with Mr. Broyhill already, correct?
Correct.
You knew that Detective Morse had spoken with him and he'd gone there with another detective, a Detective Gibney?
Correct.
And do you know, and only if you know, whether or not they recorded that interview on the and that would have been on the 23rd of April that they went, right?
I believe so, yes, sir.
The day after this happened.
Yes, sir.
And do you know if that interview was recorded?
No, sir, do not.
Okay. You are familiar, though, like you said earlier, that typically the protocol would be to try to record that.
We try, if possible.
When you went to the hospital, and you are at a hospital, you're at WakeMed, you're not at some prison hospital at that point.
That's correct.
There are protocols that are in place when a person is charged with a homicide and and at that point on the 25th of April, Mr. Broyhill is under arrest, correct?
Yes, sir.
But he has medical needs of his own at that point, correct?
Correct.
That's why he's in the hospital.
Right.
There are protocols that the department puts in place for when a prisoner is in the hospital, isn't there?
Yes, sir, it is.
They go in typically under an alias name, so people can't go in and find them
Correct.
easily. They're under guard, correct?
Correct.
There's a guard outside the room 24/7, right?
In most situations, yes, sir.
There was in this situation, if you know.
There was one on the 26th. I don't know about the 25th. I don't recall that.
Would it be typical protocol to have someone on guard for him, being that he's a homicide defendant?
Yes, sir.
And then what happens is you just keep rotating officers in. They come in for stretches, let another one go, another one comes in. They just keep changing shifts, right?
Yes, sir.
So there's a police officer outside the room or near the room pretty much at all times from the time he gets admitted in there. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
Now, you knew it was a follow-up interview. You did not know whether or not it was recorded, so I'm assuming then you did not listen to it. There was nothing, you don't recall listening to an interview prior to going to this one?
No, sir.
Okay. You recall talking to Detective Morris or Detective Gibney prior to going there on the 25th about what was said on the 23rd.
No, sir, I don't recall any content discussion.
Don't recall content, but it would not have been untypical to have had a conversation knowing that an interview had already taken place, correct?
It wouldn't have been uncommon for someone to mention something substantial had something occurred in there. If it was a basic interview where not a whole lot of information gathered, then I wouldn't know.
Right. But taking you back a little bit, you were tasked by someone with going to investigate this embezzlement thing on the 24th, correct?
Correct.
That didn't come out of thin air, right?
That is correct.
So you learned, I won't ask you about assumptions. I'll do that with Detective Morse. He'll put him on a hot seat. He's still working. Now, on that day that you went, of the 25th, the Thursday afternoon, I think you said, your testimony was, and if I'm wrong, you correct it. Did you, and you did testify a little bit about that earlier this morning, didn't you?
No, sir, not the
You did not?
25th.
Okay. Well, then I'll ask you. When you went on the 25th, you did talk to Mr. Broyhill, correct?
Just briefly.
Yeah, it was a very short thing,
Yes,
correct?
sir.
He wasn't like chasing you out of the room or telling you not to come back, correct?
That's correct.
In fact, again, being an experienced homicide detective, there are rules about when you can talk to someone who's charged with a crime so that the statements they make might be used against them in a later proceeding, like a trial like this, correct?
Oh, sure.
You have to, once a person is placed in custody, and Mr. Broyhill was in custody on the 25th, correct?
Yes, sir.
In fact, he would have been in custody on the 23rd, correct?
Yes, sir.
You have to let, it's not just a protocol, it's a law. You have to let them know that they have a right to remain silent, correct?
Yes, sir.
That they have the right to an attorney,
If he's in custody, yes, sir.
right? That they have to know that if anything they say can be used against them in the court at a later time, correct?
Correct.
That they have the right to an attorney, and if they can't afford one will be provided for them, right?
Correct.
And when you do this, if at some point the person says, I want a lawyer, you gotta stop at that point, correct?
Correct.
You can't ask them any more questions.
Well, unless you clarify, unless the person's requesting an attorney for only a specific part of the investigation, and you clarify what that is.
Which is essentially what happened here.
Correct.
There was a point where I think Mr. Broyhill expressed some, and then we're getting into the next stage, some concern about talking without a lawyer about the money thing. But he said to you, I'll talk to you about what happened at the house at 1705 Tealwood, right?
Correct.
And that's fine. He's been advised of his rights, correct?
Correct.
And the protocol would have been on the 23rd or any time that any detective who's in the homicide unit would have talked to him, was that he would have been advised of his rights before you would have gotten into any kind of substantive interview with him, correct?
I believe so, yes, sir.
But that day on the 25th, when you went over there in the evening around 6 o'clock, correct me if I'm wrong, your supplement indicates that Mr. Broyhill was not feeling particularly well or had just gotten some medication or something?
He stated that he didn't feel like talking due to some medication that he had been given and asked if we could come back the following morning.
And you said, that's fine, we'll come back tomorrow, correct?
Correct.
And that's exactly what you did. You went back the next morning, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, when you went back, prior to going back, you did, that evening, you weren't completely done. You did, on the 25th, Thursday the 25th, you didn't stop working on this case. You actually went, I believe, and assisted in the search of Mr. Broyhill's car. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
You remember where you did that?
In front of the residence at 1705 Tealwood Place.
So it was still there at that point?
Yes, sir, on the side of the street.
Had not been moved yet?
Correct.
Okay. So that's still a crime scene at that point?
Yes, sir.
Tape would be up, people would be warned not to come around, correct?
Yeah, I believe it was still secured at that time, but I'm not sure.
Does that mean an officer was there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, they leave an officer on when it's still secured for a
Normally
season.
they do. Yes, sir.
Next morning comes, and you go back to WakeMed, again with Detective Morse, correct?
Correct.
To do the interview that you couldn't do, or that you tried to do the night before, evening before, correct?
Correct.
Now, I'm not gonna get into the whole interview, the thing speaks for itself. But you sort of interjected yourself into it more toward the end of the interview.
That is correct.
It would be fair to say that Detective Morse was sort of running that interview.
Yes, sir.
And when I say running an interview, it's sort of a term of art, if you will. It's like, sometimes when you go in as two officers, two detectives, that's not just because you're trying to keep each other company. That's a procedure, right?
Not necessarily a procedure. We like having two detectives present, just like you like having two attorneys present. When you interview someone, everybody has their own ideas. Everybody hears things differently. They interpret body actions differently. It's just having two different points of view.
And some, you might pick up on something that the other person doesn't pick up on.
Correct.
Sort of the old two heads are better than one.
Correct.
And, I mean, not just as a homicide detective, but as a detective in general. I mean, you receive training on how to conduct interviews, correct?
Yes, sir.
I mean, they're not all the same, are they?
They're all different.
They're all very different.
Yes, sir.
Sometimes you gotta go into a room and you gotta let somebody know, you're in charge because they're acting all, maybe get some smart mouth kid who's like, thinks he's tough and is gonna play tough guy with you. I mean, you might get that. You might get the person who's crying and sobbing. You might get the person who's not telling you they won't talk, but they're telling you all kinds of stories, right?
They're all different.
They're all different. And they teach you different techniques on how to deal with each one, right?
Yes, sir.
Sometimes you got to get aggressive with people. Sometimes you got to like put an arm around them and calm them down. And sometimes you got to just look them square in the eye. And it just varies. It's case to case, right?
Correct.
In this particular instance, at least with respect to the events involving Mr. Hahn and Ms. Hahn, Mr. Broyhill was not hesitant to speak with you, was he?
No, sir. Not at all.
He had, and you knew from, as we said earlier, he had spoken before.
Correct.
In fact, when he was being read his rights by Detective Morse about the right to an attorney, he said, yeah, I understand the right. I'm probably going to need a court-appointed lawyer, but I'll talk to you, correct?
He did say that he would be willing to talk with us. I believe the court appointed came later.
Do you have the,
Can you advise what page?
take a look
Oh.
around.
I do. I see that.
You see it?
He did state that he would need a court appointed attorney when it got to that point.
That was right after he'd been advised of his rights, correct?
That is correct.
But he said, but I'm gonna talk with you, correct?
Correct.
Then for the bulk of the interview that follows, the questions are being directed to him by Detective Morse, and at that point, I mean, you could jump in, but at that point, Detective Morse is asking questions, he's being responsive, so the thing you did was you sort of became an observer at that point.
That's correct.
And for lack of a better phrase, you're not just there to watch, you're an active observer. If something's said or something that might cause you to jump in, you're on the ready to do that. I mean, the whole purpose of this is to see if you can get a statement that explains these events, right?
Well, normally I will not jump in until the lead detective gets to a point to where he feels comfortable with the interview. And normally, even myself will ask the other detective, is there any questions that you'd like to ask, or do you have anything before we conclude? I don't like to interject during an interview. I'll let the detective complete his first.
And that's essentially what you did here.
Correct.
Trying to get to it. Maybe I was gonna say 60 pages or so, 50 and 60 pages into a transcript of this before you started to interject yourself, correct?
Correct.
And with that, you were asking Mr. Broyhill at that point about some of the things that you had learned from talking to John Wallace, correct?
Correct.
And at that point, you had also had the letters that had been sent to you by Mr. Wallace, correct?
I believe at that point I had pulled those letters up on the FEC website and printed them myself. I don't think I had received the copies from Mr. Wallace at that point.
When you were questioning him, because you talked to Mr. Wallace the afternoon of the 25th. This is now the morning of the 26th. You noted that in your conversation with Mr. Wallace, he never brought up with you the thing about the FEC questioning refunds to certain donors to the campaign. He didn't bring that up with you, Mr. Wallace, when you spoke with him on the 25th. At least you made no note of it in your supplement regarding your conversation on the 25th.
Give me that question again. Make sure I
You spoke
understand.
with Mr. Wallace on the 25th, on the Thursday afternoon,
Correct.
and he brought up with you well, he had, like you said, lengthy interview, and he was talking to you about those letters
Correct.
that popped up. I think it's on, you have your supplement ahead of you?
Yes, sir.
Maybe page 4 of your interview, of your supplement? Your supplement dated May 22nd, is that,
Yes.
May 7th, 2013? He brought up, after seeing the letters, the help, you never put anything in your supplement about him mentioning that donors had been refunded more money than they had been given. You didn't put anything about that in your supplement, did you? When you're referring to your conversation with him on the 25th.
I don't believe I did.
But I noted that when you were with Mr. Broyhill in the hospital the following day, in the morning of the 26th, you were aware of it because you brought it up with him. You asked him about, what is this thing about the FEC questioning individuals making donations and refunds being given back in excess of the amount of their donation?
That was from the letter, one of the letters on the FEC website.
Right, you found that. You
Correct.
found that on your own, right?
After I was advised about the letters existing from Mr. Wallace.
You went and looked them up and
Yes, sir.
read them, and now you're asking Mr. Broyhill about that.
Correct.
Because one of the things that he said to you was, maybe this thing I mean, he was just speculating, but he said maybe this is what caused the confrontation between Mr. Broyhill and Ms. Hahn. So you're looking to see, well, what's in the letter that would cause a confrontation, right?
Correct.
And that was something you noticed from the letter. You noticed it from the letter.
That is correct.
So you asked him about it. But he didn't really respond about that as being much of an issue, did he?
No, he did not.
You asked him about the Time Warner cable bill, right?
I did.
He told you that he was aware of it and Jamie was aware of it, correct?
Correct.
In fact, she didn't make much of it because she thought it was some kind of a scheme or something of somebody trying to collect on this thing, correct? I think that's the words that Mr. Broyhill used.
Correct.
I think at that point, that's when Detective Morse jumped in a little bit about that Time Warner cable bill to see if that was much of an issue, right?
That is correct.
But, I mean, we heard it. It didn't seem of much concern to Mr. Broyhill that day, did it?
No, sir.
Then you got into it, and when I say got into it with, I don't mean like you're getting confrontational with him. I mean, none of this was confrontational, was it?
Not at all.
He was very cooperative.
Yes, sir.
He was answering your questions.
Yes, sir.
He was admitting to you and Detective Morse a lot of lies, wasn't he? I mean, there were some questions asked him if he had certain diseases,
Correct.
like the MS and the
Correct.
cancer. He basically said it's not true, right?
Correct.
He asked about whether he had gallbladder surgery. He told you it wasn't true, right?
Correct.
I mean, so he's telling you all this.
Correct.
But when it comes to this Time Warner cable bill, it's like, no, that wasn't a big deal, right?
Did not appear to be.
Then you started to ask him, and rightfully so, about money missing. He's giving you amounts in the thousands that he's telling you about, correct?
Correct.
Keeping in mind that you weren't there on the 23rd.
Correct.
But you were there on the 26th when you heard Detective Morris ask him about, could it be in excess of $60,000? His response was he just didn't know how much he'd taken. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
Now, he admitted certain things to you that day, like the diseases and that weren't true.
That's correct.
You're a homicide detective and you didn't get there overnight. You've been a detective and all these other things. Fair to say, in your job, over the close to 30 years that you did it, you had to deal with people not being straight up with you a lot.
Frequently. Yes, sir.
When there is no follow-up conversation from you or Detective Morris that day, at that point in time, beyond what we heard regarding the amount of money that Mr. Broyhill had taken from this campaign account. What it is what it is, correct?
Follow up with the defendant?
Yes.
No, sir.
Now, that happened in the morning on the 26th. How don't think you made mention of the time, but, or do you recall the time when you actually got there?
I did not make mention of the time, did not document it.
Okay. But you went back to the station, where your offices are, and at 10:53 that morning, you got a call from John Wallace. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And he told you at 10:53, after the interview, that he'd been down to the bank and he had learned that money had been embezzled from the account.
He stated that it appeared that that there had been funds embezzled from the account.
Now, he's contacting you after you're back from the hospital.
Correct.
You're asking him, and Detective Morris is asking him about embezzlement prior to hearing from Mr. Wallace, correct?
Prior to hearing this part from Mr. Wallace, correct.
And you had investigated embezzlement prior to that, starting on the 24th, when you were calling the SBI and the Board of Elections, and then Mr. Wallace the next day.
That is correct.
That's the first time he notified you about the money being gone, was the 26th, after that interview, correct?
Correct.
Did you know about Mr. Broyhill telling you that he embezzled funds, telling the department he had embezzled funds on the 23rd, the day after this happened?
The only thing that I know is I documented when I was briefed by Detectives Fry and Torrance that I thought I had documented at that time that there was some communication between Mr. Hahn and one of the officers about funds.
But actually, there is nothing in your supplement from the 22nd about that, is
That is correct. I believe that came from one of the officers with Mr. Hahn.
The first thing you mentioned in your supplement about investigating embezzlement comes on April 24th, when you start doing your investigation.
That is correct.
Now, you don't know necessarily the content, you don't know what was said, you don't know what was recorded. Do you know, or did you know, that Mr. Broyhill had been interviewed by Detective Morris or Detective Gibbon on the 23rd?
I'm aware of the interview, not aware of the content.
But am I right on the date?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Arbor, we'll take a 10-minute recess.
Judge, if you give me a second, I might be done with Detective
Very
Gill,
well.
and then he could be released.
All right, it's about 4:05, but if you're just
Yeah,
a few
can I
more
just have a
minutes.
minute with co-counsel?
Yes, sir.
And I don't want to delay Detective Gill from his retirement any further. Thank you. I have no other questions.
Mr. Fawcett.
Detective Gill, looking at page 3 of your supplement, as to your phone interview with John Wallace on April 25th, that afternoon, what did Mr. Wallace indicate to you about the meeting that he had with Mr. Broyhill and Ms. Hahn in his office about what, if any, documents were presented to him and by whom?
He stated that he met with both John and Jamie on Tuesday of that week. The meeting occurred in his office in the conference room between 9 and 9:30 in the morning. And when they met, the only document that John had with him was a draft report for the filing at the end of the first quarter of 2013.
Thank you.
Mr. Arbor, anything further? All right. Thank you, sir. You may step down. All right, we'll take a recess until 20 minutes past 4. Please, members of the jury, recall the instructions. Don't talk among yourselves or with anyone else. Yes. We're actually going to recess for the afternoon at this time, and we'll resume tomorrow morning at 9:30. So please recall the instructions for the evening. Don't talk about this case among yourselves or with anyone else. Don't allow anyone to talk about it in your presence. Don't form or express any opinions about the outcome of this case. Please don't conduct any independent investigation. Don't read, view, or listen to any media accounts. And again, I caution you, there is media coverage, so be very careful around any media outlets. And please have no conversations with parties, witnesses, or lawyers. If you'll leave your notepads and your notebook there in the chair, the bailiff will be taking away the notebooks, the transcript, and your notepads to be returned to you in the morning. Thank you very much for your service. We'll see you at 9:30 tomorrow morning. To go ahead and put a ruling on the record regarding the request of the defendants to require the state to omit transcripts of interviews conducted on April 23rd and April 25th in connection with their introduction of the transcript of the April 26th interview, which was introduced as State's Exhibit 53 and 54 was the April 26th transcript. So in my consideration of this matter, I'm guided by Rule 106 of the North Carolina Rules of Evidence, which has been interpreted to give the trial court the discretion to determine what might be required to fairly explain an admitted portion of a transcript, to fairly place it in context, or to fairly prevent it from being misleading in some other regard. This rule is also known as the completeness rule. It's codified, like I said, in Rule 106, and is merely to ensure that a misleading impression created by taking matters out of context is corrected on the spot because of the inadequacy of repair work when delayed to a point later in the trial. It is up to the trial court to decide what is closely related, and the standard of review is whether the trial court uses its discretion. It is the defendant's burden under this rule to demonstrate that the tapes and transcripts of these, or to demonstrate that the tapes and the transcripts of these two other interviews were somehow out of context when they were the defendant must demonstrate that the exhibit that was introduced was somehow out of context when it was introduced into evidence, and the defendant must also demonstrate that that the other two interviews were either explanatory of or relevant to the interview that was admitted. I've carefully reviewed the three recorded statements, namely that dated April 23rd, April 25th, and April 26th. April 26th being the one that was admitted. The other two were identified as court's exhibits. The transcripts were identified as court's exhibits. All right. So 6, 7, and 8 And in comparing each of these statements with the April 26th interview, the court finds no instance where the statements contained in the April 26th interview require further explanation by any excerpts from the April 23rd or the April 25th interview. Likewise, the court finds no instance where the statements in the 426 interview were rendered out of context or misleading in the absence of excerpts from the April 23rd or April 25th interview. So in sum, the court finds that there's nothing contained in the interviews conducted on April 23rd or April 25th that under Rule 106 ought in fairness to be considered contemporaneously with the statements of April 26, and therefore the defendant's objection is overruled.